The story of Arthur Shawcross does not begin with the chilling discovery of bodies near the Genesee River. It begins decades earlier, in 1945, in the small town of Kittery, Maine, where he was born into a household marked by instability, silence, and secrets. Those who later studied his life pointed to his childhood as the breeding ground of the darkness that would one day spill over into 11 brutal murders. Growing up, Shawcross struggled with learning difficulties and emotional problems. Teachers describe him as withdrawn, distant, and unpredictable. Later psychological evaluations revealed that he suffered significant head injuries in childhood, traumas, linked in many criminal studies to impulsive violence and impaired empathy. But those signs went unnoticed for years. Neighbors saw a boy who kept to himself. His family insisted that everything was normal. Yet Arthur himself would later claim that his early years were filled with abuse, claims that investigators could never fully confirm, but which became a recurring theme in his attempts to explain the violence that shaped his adulthood. Shawcross's life shifted dramatically. When he joined the Army in 1967, he served in Vietnam, working in supply units rather than direct combat, but the experience left deep psychological scars. He later insisted, though with no official record to support it, that he witnessed and committed acts of violence during his deployment. Some experts argued these claims were exaggerated or fabricated, yet others believed that the stress of the war environment may have aggravated pre-existing psychological disorders. When he returned to the United States, he tried to build a normal life. He married multiple times, worked in factories, drove trucks, and seemed on the surface like a quiet, unremarkable man. But beneath that calm exterior was a growing storm. In 1972, the first violent crimes attributed to him occurred. A 10-year-old boy, Jack Owen Blake, disappeared while playing near a river in Watertown, New York. Shawcross was the last person seen with him. Evidence was thin, but suspicions were strong. Months later, the child's body was found, brutally killed. At nearly the same time, another child, 8-year-old Karen and Hill, disappeared. Her body was discovered under a bridge. The community was terrified, and investigators had only one real suspect, Arthur Shawcross. Under pressure, he eventually confessed to both murders. But what shocked the public even more was what happened next. Despite the severity of the crimes, Shawcross was sentenced to only 25 years in prison, a sentence many considered shockingly lenient for the murder of 2 children. Psychiatric evaluations labeled him as dangerous and deeply disturbed, but his attorneys negotiated a plea deal that allowed him to avoid a life sentence. Even worse, he served just 14 years. His release in 1987 became one of the most controversial decisions in New York criminal history. No one could have predicted how catastrophic that decision would be. After his release, officials moved him repeatedly from town to town as outraged residents protested his presence. Finally, settling in Rochester, he appeared outwardly calm, friendly, polite. He worked at a food distribution company and blended into his new neighborhood so well that most people barely noticed him. But inside, the same violent impulses were stirring once again. In 1988, the pattern began. Women started disappearing, mostly sex workers who frequented the downtown areas. Their disappearances were dismissed at first, attributed to unstable lifestyles. But then bodies began turning up near the Genesee River. 11 victims in total. 11 lives taken by a man who walked freely among the people, searching for answers. Police struggled to connect the dots. Shawcross didn't fit the stereotype of a serial killer. He wasn't charismatic, or intelligent, or particularly organized. Yet he was methodical in choosing victims who lived on the margins of society, victims who would not immediately be missed, victims whose cases would not spark immediate alarm. As bodies appeared one after another, detectives realized that a single predator was hunting in their city, a predator who understood the landscape, the river, the woods, and the blind spots in law enforcement. And through it all, Shawcross continued living his quiet, deceptive double life. visiting the very locations where he left his victims, watching the police work, even discussing the crimes casually with acquaintances. He was hiding in plain sight. And no one yet suspected how close he really was. As winter tightened its grip on Rochester, the investigation into the mounting deaths grew more urgent. Detectives formed a special task force, one that included experts in behavioral science, forensic pathology, and geographic profiling. They needed to understand the killer's mind. They needed to predict his next move before another body surfaced near the Genesee River. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit reviewed the evidence and constructed a profile that painted a chilling picture. A white male in his 40s or 50s, familiar with the area, likely with a history of violence or sexual offenses. Someone who would appear ordinary, maybe even friendly, to those around him. The profiler noted something else. The killer revisited his dump sites. This detail would later become the key that unlocked the entire case. Meanwhile, Shawcross continued his routine as though nothing were happening. He ate at local diners, chatted with coworkers, and maintained his relationship with his girlfriend, Rose. No one suspected that he was using his car for late-night drives to secluded areas, where his victims' bodies lay hidden beneath leaves, mud, and snow. The turning point came in January 1990. A police helicopter, scanning the frozen river area, noticed a familiar grey car parked near the woods, an area where one of the victims had been found. This was not a coincidence. Cameras focused in. The license plate was recorded. The car belonged to Arthur Shawcross. A surveillance team began tailing him immediately. What they witnessed was unnerving. Shawcross drove repeatedly to locations connected to the murders, sometimes stopping to stare silently at the landscape as though reliving memories. On one of these visits, detectives decided they'd seen enough. They arrested him. At first, Shawcross denied everything, but faced with mounting evidence, fibers, tire tracks, witness statements, GPS-style mapping of his movements, his resistance began to crack. The interrogation room became the theater of his unraveling. Over several hours, he shifted from denial to rambling stories filled with deflections and excuses. Then, something in him broke. He began confessing, methodically, emotionlessly, recounting details only the killer could know. He described the victims. He described the locations. He described what he did, and why he thought they deserved it. His justifications were chilling and filled with cruelty. Experts later determined he displayed signs of antisocial personality disorder, extreme impulsivity, and a complete lack of empathy. Some psychiatrists argued he suffered from brain damage and PTSD. Others believed he was fully aware and deliberately manipulative. His trial in 1991 drew national attention. Courtrooms were filled daily with journalists, psychologists, and families of victims. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, while the defense attempted to argue diminished capacity, claiming Shawcross entered fugue-like states where he lost control. But the jury was unconvinced. The cold precision of his crimes told a different story. Shawcross was convicted of 10 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 250 years in prison, effectively a life sentence, with no possibility of release. Inside the prison walls, he became a subject of intense psychological study. Journalists interviewed him, criminology students dissected his behavior, and forensic psychiatrists analyzed his mind. Shawcross loved the attention. He gave lengthy interviews, describing his crimes in disturbing detail, often contradicting himself and shifting blame. He even tried to portray himself as a victim of childhood trauma and war memories. Researchers noted a pattern common among serial killers: the desire for control, not just over victims, but over narrative and legacy. In 2008, after nearly 2 decades behind bars, Arthur Shawcross died of a heart attack at the age of 63. For the families of the victims, his death brought a complicated mixture of relief and frustration. Relief that he was gone. Frustration that he could never fully answer for the pain he caused. Today, his case remains one of the most controversial in American criminal history, especially because he was released once before the murders began, a decision that allowed him to kill again. Criminologists still study his behavior to understand how someone so outwardly average could harbor such immense brutality, and how systems meant to protect society can fail so severely. And in Rochester, the Genesee River flows on, quiet, cold, and eternal, carrying memories of the horrors once concealed along its banks.